Good morning, everyone. My name is Shelby Smittu, and I would like to welcome you to session D2, Spotlight on Mitigation Techniques. And while the coffee is running through your veins, we're going to go ahead and get started. First up, we have Mary-Carson Stiff. She is the Director of Policy at Wetland Watch, and will be speaking with us today about FEMA acquired properties and land trust. We'll switch over to Mary.
Hi, my name is Mary-Carson Stiff, and I'm the Policy Director at Wetlands Watch. I'm going to be talking about a pilot project that attempts to transfer FEMA acquired properties from a city to a land trust. The city doesn't want to be involved anymore, and the land trust doesn't want to agree to take the transfer of the properties if the transfer documentation doesn't adequately reflect the best practices of the land trust community. So, can we make it work? A little bit of background about Wetlands Watch. We're an environmental nonprofit based in Norfolk, Virginia, working statewide on the preservation of wetlands. We do this primarily through sea level rise adaptation. Our program areas are included on the screen, and my focus is on FEMA programs and nature-based policy development. This is a map of the area of the project I'm going to be talking about. Here we are, the city of Chesapeake. This is where the pilot's taking place. This map shows how sea level rise projections will impact the area. This is really to indicate that we're looking at flooding impacts from all directions here in the city of Chesapeake, coming from the north in North Carolina, as well as from coming from the south, from the Chesapeake Bay, then the James River and the Elizabeth River. So high risk area. In Hampton Roads or southeastern Virginia, which is where this project is located and where Wetlands Watch's works, we are looking at planning estimates based on the NOAA intermediate high curve of about 1.5 feet by 2050. That's a doubled rate from a past century, and about 3 feet by 2080. So why does Wetlands Watch care about sea level rise? A shocking 99% of Virginia's shoreline lands are privately owned. So people living along our waterways want to protect their property from coastal erosion and flooding. And they often are doing so using methods like the bulkhead shown here. The problem is that wetlands in front of hard barriers or even steep slopes have nowhere to go, so they drown in place with sea level rise. Virginia can lose about 50 to 80% of its vegetated tidal wetlands in the coming century if there aren't modifications made to allow for species to migrate into the shoreline. At Wetlands Watch, we're working to identify solutions to this problem. The solutions that are being used, however, in most of our region are not necessarily long-term solutions, and they look like what you can see here on your screen. So a lot of home elevations. Our region has about $40 billion of unmet mitigation needs on private property alone. The current pace of grant funding cannot keep up with the need, and the solutions, as I mentioned, are not long-term and don't consider the life cycle costs of maintaining the mitigated structure in place. We know that elevation is essential to protect people and properties, but we do know that it is definitely a short-term solution, and that our local governments, utilities, and emergency service programs are on the hook ultimately to service these properties, and the roads are still underwater, frequently putting the people at risk. Home elevation specifically won't work in areas where flooding looks like this multiple times a year. It's going to take a lot of money to maintain services when this is the type of inundation that is happening with some varying frequency. The picture on the right is my neighborhood, and so I just feel like, you know, I'm living this firsthand, and I know that the only solution in this area is to get people and structures out of the way. The risks are too great and the inundation is too severe. These are both taken in the city of Norfolk on areas where there's no storm in sight, maybe a strong wind during a fall high tide. So at Wetlands Watch, we're thinking a lot about how to use nature to protect our shoreline properties. This type of protection offers the opportunity, when it's planted and installed correctly, for the wetland species to migrate landward. It's what happens once the species migrate towards the houses where the real challenge begins. And that's one of the reasons why we're working on this pilot. We're running a project that's multi-year, and it explores how to remove people from risk using land conservation and adaptive land management strategies. Our pilot's in partnership with a local land trust, the Living River Trust, and working in 2 cities that are suburban and urban. We know that buyouts are becoming increasingly popular across the country, as buyouts acquisitions are the 100 most effective way to reduce flood risk. And our pilot's exploring how we get people out of the way. And when they're out of the way, what do we do with the land that remains? If there's going to be more buyouts, that means more vacant land. And in our urban and suburban communities where we're working, these vacant lands are invariably in residential neighborhoods, and they're checkerboarded throughout, which is kind of how everybody is experiencing acquisitions in a residential context. So how do we turn this negative community impact into something positive? Can we develop programs and policies that could be exportable to other communities struggling with the same issues? The 2 different pilots that we're working on are listed here on the slide. However, we're just going to talk about the first, the Chesapeake project. So this is the feasibility of a property transfer of the FEMA acquisition open space properties from the city of Chesapeake to the Living River Trust, that land trust that's at the center of all this work. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And if you want to know about the other project in the city of Norfolk, contact me and I'll share a lot of information about that. So here's some background. The city of Chesapeake has a strong, for our region and for Virginia, acquisition program. We have 38 open space lots. And again, you know, this is big for our region. It's certainly not Harris County, but for us, it's a significant program. Under the FEMA grant, y'all know this, I'm sure, structures must be removed and the property is open space forever through a deed restriction. The city is responsible to report to FEMA, and they do that through the state agency. And every 3 years is that reporting. So the city staff has all these properties, right? And they approached the Living River Trust and said, hey, you all are land managers. City of Chesapeake, we're not really experts in land management, but nevertheless, we're finding ourselves managing these open parcels that are in conservation. And because they're in residential neighborhoods, that management is really mowing. And the mowing is expensive. It's $90,000 for all of their acquisition parcels in the city. So how can they leverage their existing relationship? They were friends with the Living River Trust, this land trust. How can they leverage that relationship and then also address some of their concerns with not having the expertise to manage land, conservation land, and then having to pay a lot to do mowing because they don't have the bandwidth to do restoration, for example, or something that would reduce the mowing cost. So the city proposed 5 contiguous, open, already acquired shoreline parcels as pilot for this effort. They also offered to reduce the tax liability for the Living River Trust. Land trusts are 501c3s, and they, of course, have limited resources because they're in charge of raising their own revenue. The project goal, again, is to determine whether a land trust could and should accept land acquired through the FEMA acquisition program without any locality involvement. So the city of Chesapeake says, hey, we don't want to be involved with this anymore. Y'all are the land conservation managers. You all should be able to handle reporting to FEMA, and we're just going to walk away and work on some other stuff. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And we know, you can see could is crossed out here. We know that they're allowed to because the FEMA acquisition program contemplates this type of a relationship. It's just whether or not they should, because as I'll explain, the FEMA program contemplates the relationship, but it doesn't quite reflect the realities and kind of best management practices of the land trust community. So we're trying to make those programs talk to each other in a way that makes sense for both FEMA and for the land trust communities. So here's a look at the 5 parcels that were proposed by the city. You can see that there's quite a lot of flood risk in this area with a lot of the different creeks that you can see coming from the southern branch of the Elizabeth River. Here is a close-up of the parcels. You can see that these properties were built without a nice natural buffer between the residents and the creek. So it's an older development. And I just want to note that this neighborhood has so much flood risk, and you can see where buyouts have actually happened already, or in addition to the 5 that are proposed. So this neighborhood is definitely in a transition. And you can see from the image on the right that the flood risk is only going to increase with time. This is a 2050, so 1.5 feet of sea level rise projection. And the colored section, the water, that's a daily inundation, regular tidal inundation. So the risk is increasing, and the need to remove people out of the way, is great. So before we talk about the nuts and bolts of the transfer process, I wanted to just share kind of where we're getting at, like how can we transform these properties so people aren't mowing the grass like they're doing here. These are some images, examples from North Miami and the stormwater park that was designed there by the Department Design Office. And you can see that they transformed this FEMA lot into a beautiful neighborhood pocket park with great pathways and wonderful plant life. And at the center of the park is a BMP, a best management practice. So this retention pond is providing an educational opportunity for people to learn about what happens with flood storage and reduction, but it's also offering flood mitigation in real time. And they have the added amenity of a neighborhood park feature. So this is kind of the gold standard. And the people from the Department Design Office are a part of our larger pilot looking at this issue. So what do the parcels look like in the city of Chesapeake? Well, they look like this, right? So you can see where some, the homes were. This is 1, 2, 3 lots. Actually 1, 2, 3, and then the third is kind of over here. This area is this area in the picture, with some nice upland in the sense that it's not directly in the wetland, but here there's a lot of wetland frontage across all 5 of the properties. If you recall, the stream kind of goes along all the 5 properties. So wonderful opportunities for wetland restoration and a park amenity. And we've actually had some students from the Virginia Tech's architecture program create some designs based off of the space and visits, not quite in person because of COVID, unfortunately, but using drone imagery and satellite imagery. And they created some options that for how a park could be created, or how the parcels could be transformed to reflect the interests of the community, as well as reduce the maintenance for the land conservation organization. So you see they superimposed actual images of the parcels. You can see the existing structures with some different ideas about how to engage with the space. So really cool opportunity, right? This could be great for the land trust, could be great for the city of Chesapeake, but how do we actually get it done? Here is a look at the transfer process as outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations for the acquisition program, for everyone to follow the guidance. We know that the FEMA regional administrator has to authorize the transfer. This is true for any transfer of acquisition properties that occurs anywhere in the country. Whatever region you're in, the FEMA regional administrator has to approve the process. This is how the process works. The local government requests the transfer through the state agency. The state agency makes the request to the FEMA regional administrator. So again, we're looking at, we know this transfer is allowed, but should the Living River Trust agree to the transfer with no local governments being involved? We know that there are 2 land trusts that have agreed to transfers of FEMA acquired properties elsewhere in the country, in Alabama and Mississippi, but the local government has stayed involved, and all of the legal documentation, which I'm going to talk about in a second, was not modified to reflect kind of the land conservation communities practices, but was just adopted verbatim. And I'm sure that's because the city was still involved and on the hook for a lot of the reporting, enforcement, maintenance, et cetera. So the things that a land trust would really be thinking about if they were to be the long-term steward and owner of the properties. So the governance docs. So how do we figure out whether or not this can work? So let me just back up and say that this pilot, these 2 different projects in the city of Norfolk and the city of Chesapeake, involves, as I said, a multi-year effort with lots of different stakeholders and what we call thought leaders at the table, working through a lot of the big issues related to the execution of the 2 pilots. So for the city of Chesapeake, There are a couple working groups that are working on the specific issue, and one working group in particular had over 50 conservation, emergency management, local staff, representatives from the state, professionals who were digging deep into all the governance documents, reviewing modification of language, and assessing the whole situation and this, this transfer scenario, hearing from the land conservation professionals' perspective, the land conservation professionals hearing from the local staff perspective, or emergency manager's perspective, et cetera. So there was this back and forth, wonderful interplay between all of these experts at the table working on this together. So I just want to say that that's a really important part of this pilot. We've been working for years on this potential transfer, and it's that years of time was really spent cultivating relationships and making sure what we were doing and thinking about was kind of nationally applicable and rooted in expert knowledge. So we had to do a deep dive into all of the authorities to make sure we understood exactly what the land trust would be signing up for. And you can see the authorities listed here. So is this a perfect union? Can we get the FEMA acquisition program to speak the land conservation program language? What we really discovered is that the FEMA acquisition program, like I said, always contemplated the relationship between conservation organizations, land trusts, and conservation, or excuse me, acquired lands. But what we really think the issue is that during the time of the program creation and all the guidance document creation, it may have been the case that a land trust professional that's in the weeds on deed language and best practices from the National Association of Land Trusts may not have been at the table. Some of the language is inconsistent and would make a land trust wary of adopting the language in the deed restriction, which is informed by the Code of Federal Regulation verbatim. And so we know that based off of all of that review with all those stakeholders, that the conservation community would want the deed of restrictions to be modified to address their concerns. And if the deed of restrictions was not allowed to be modified, right, so we had to ask FEMA if we could modify it, then the land trust had to decide if they were going to accept the FEMA deed restrictions as written. And we looked at the deed restrictions, we talked about it ad nauseum, which I've already kind of said, and the Living River Trust actually decided that they could not accept the restriction as written. And so FEMA, luckily for us, said that yes, we could make some modifications to the deed restriction and submit it for FEMA review. And so we weren't sure they were going to say yes, but we did know that we could modify the language to address the concerns of the land conservation community, which we did. An example of this intensive review, I just have one example, one slide to not kind of bore people with the nitty gritty, but essentially, one example of why this isn't a direct, why the FEMA program doesn't exactly speak land conservation language is related to the instruments that are contemplated. The guidance references the use of a conservation easement. But when a transfer actually occurs, the full, all of the bundle of your sticks of the property is actually transferred. And so a conservation easement doesn't make sense on land that's already owned by a land conservation organization. And so it's in fact a deed restriction that needs to be used. But when you have a deed restriction that's owned, that's on property owned by a land trust that's governed by its own kind of rules about not developing conserved land, then you need to have somebody enforcing those rules at the table. So you need to have somebody who says, we are going to make sure the land trust actually adheres to all of the land conservation restrictions. So it's like a backstop to make sure the land trust does what it's supposed to do. And so that wasn't really in existence in the deed restriction language. So we changed the deed restriction to reflect this requirement for best management practices for the land conservation community. So we made FEMA a third-party enforcer, and the state is its backup. So there are two different entities that are going to make the land trust do what it's supposed to do, basically. And that kind of third-party enforcer language is an example of the land conservation community really wanting language that is appursuant to their programs in the modified deed language that they would propose to FEMA. So that's an example of one of the reasons why we had to make these modifications. Many more modifications were made, but the modifications did not alter the intention of the acquisition or the intention of the open space uses on the property. Everything was kind of language and specifics related to process. So that's really important to note. So we modified the deed language using an actual deed that was recorded at the time of one of the property's acquisitions. So there's 5 parcels. This is a real deed. And we modified the language to reflect the interests of the land conservation community. This took quite a while, and we had lots of different thought leaders, remember those people, a part of our work groups, vet the language. Again, wanting to make sure that what we were doing was something that could work outside of FEMA Region 3. So edits were made and the draft deed was completed. Once the work group approved the draft deed, Wetlands Watch project team sent it to the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. The Virginia Department of Emergency Management then sent it to the Attorney General's office, and they made some modifications. And then VDEM sent that draft to FEMA Region 3 for their review, to the administrator in particular. And what happened is that FEMA Region 3 said yes, and they approved the transfer of all 5 properties with a new language from the City of Chesapeake to the Living River Trust. So what's even better about this whole process is the timeline in which it occurred. Lightning speed here from FEMA and from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. It was a really wonderful experience with great partnerships and nice relationship cultivation across the board. We were thrilled with this timeline. So October 2020 to just, I'm recording this on April 27th, and it's was approved just a couple weeks ago. So huge and very fast. So as I mentioned, the draft deed, that specific deed to the properties, was approved. Now, the difference is that this is approved in FEMA Region 3, which were, check, gangbusters, it's so exciting. However, what we really want and what we know based off of all of this kind of cultivation of relationships, et cetera, is that the land trust community is probably going to want to engage more in this space. And the local governments are probably going to want the land conservation community to engage more in this space in the future. This is not something new. We know that in New Jersey, the wonderful Green Acres program has been incredibly popular. We know that land trusts are referenced in various different climate adaptation pieces of literature, and we just know that this relationship between acquisition of flood-prone property and conservation of the land that remains is something that is going to grow and expand as time passes and risk becomes greater. So can we get that draft language approved into some sort of national model that can be replicable elsewhere by other groups, other regions, other states? So we took the FEMA model deed restriction, which is the principal document that's used, and everybody copies and pastes it, and then that's the language that's actually recorded at the local community level. And we modified it to reflect the specific scenario in which we got approval. So the property transfer from locality to a qualified conservation organization. So we took the language verbatim from what was approved by FEMA Region 3, and we have submitted the new model deed restriction to FEMA headquarters. And our goal is to see if they can incorporate this new model deed as an option for communities that are interested in engaging in the same type of transfer, where they'd be off the hook for managing the properties, and the land trust would be engaging in that specific role in their place. So can this be nationally applicable? We don't know. We're hoping that it will be. And we think that, again, this type of relationship between the land trust community and local governments doing flood mitigation is just going to grow. There's more and more interest, and we even have a state fund in Virginia that's prioritizing acquisitions. And we know that the land trust community is eager to partner with local governments on projects that are exciting to them. And local governments, again, are excited about this relationship because of all of the issues that I mentioned related to cost of mowing, lack of expertise in actually being a land manager, especially a conservation lands manager. And very anecdotally, briefly, we do know that communities have abandoned their acquisition programs. They're now dormant because they do not have this level of expertise to do the actual management of the land themselves. So the applications seem endless to us, and we really hope that this request will be considered and that we'll be able to see more land trusts stepping into this space and partnering with local staff at the local level. So that's all I have. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to engaging in the question and answer. Thanks so much.
Mary, that was a great presentation. Very impressed on FEMA's timeline of making that happen. But we do have a handful of questions, not much time. So we're just going to go ahead and get to it. Let's see. Based on the aerial view, it looked like the area of the 5 lots would be less than 3 acres. So how do you convince your land trust to become interested?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, we had a land conservation committee meeting of the land trust just yesterday talking about how we move forward, and we get to yes. So luckily, the land trust is urban and is very familiar and comfortable with small parcels. We have conservation easements on 2-acre parcels that are residential. So it's not wholly unusual for us to even accept a property that small with a structure on it. Yeah, the land trust interest, especially because the conservation has already happened, the property isn't at risk of being developed. That's kind of where the rubber hits the road for the land trust, and the kind of potential for wetlands restoration is what the land trust greatest interest is. So this concept of doing something more with these parcels rather than just having them be mowed is where the land trust is most interested, and where I think the trigger will come into play and in terms of getting them to a yes. So great restoration potential, and the land trust has a mitigation arm that I didn't talk about that basically means that they kind of do a lot of wetlands restoration, sediment remediation, and it could be of financial interest to the land trust to do restoration work on those small parcels.
Okay, great. If the lots were to transfer, would the trust still maintain the land in perpetuity?
Yes, which was the need for that third-party enforcer. Yes, there would still be deed restrictions, and deed restrictions do carry force of law.
Great. Did you ever consider a 99-year lease, which could have been an accomplished goal of involving the trust?
So I'm not familiar with the 99-year lease. Conservation organizations deal in perpetuity, so forever, and that's kind of required by the IRS and required by state statute for conservation. And the FEMA program, in addition, I assume the 99-year lease would mean not the full bundle of sticks ownership, but a partial ownership, a leaseship of the land. So no, I guess is the short answer. We didn't.
All right. And it looks like there's a couple people interested in your example of a deed restriction. Would you be able to share that with them or make that available?
Yes.
Okay.
If somebody wants to email me, please do so, or we can chat. I don't know if there's that function in the conference, but I'll be in the conference all week.
Okay, that sounds great. That looks like all the questions we have for you, Mary. You did a great job and very informative.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Okay, next up we have Tammie Blaney. Tammie is the Executive Director of the International Association of Structural Movers, and today she will be speaking with us about home elevation for flood hazard mitigation.
So Shelby, can I tell folks right now that I have that little break on my video?
Sure.
I don't know if people can hear me, but at one point I had attempted to embed a video into my presentation and it doesn't look like it's stuck. So that's about 1 minute, but the presentation goes on right after that. I just want people to be aware of that the whole presentation doesn't end at that point.
We can discuss that at the Q&A session.
Hello. I am trying to get my presentation all set here. You are joining the home elevation for flood hazard mitigation presentation. And this presentation I'm giving on behalf of the International Association of Structural Movers. And our association is made up of professionals who are lifting and moving buildings across the country and across the world. So one of the reasons why they are actively engaged in that work is for flood hazard mitigation. So a little bit about the ISM's history. The International Association of Structural Movers is a professional trade association that was founded in 1983. We typically have in any given year 300 members worldwide. The majority of our members are in the United States, with about 15% coming from Canada. And then we have members in a lot of other countries, including New Zealand, Australia, Argentina. We just have members in a lot of different countries that are moving and lifting buildings. The purpose of the ISM is education. So whether we're educating our members or whether we're educating the public, our main purpose is education. So we're always trying to educate people that are actively engaged in structural moving and lifting and educate them on best practices and opportunities for growth and other things with their companies. We also are actively always engaged in educating communities on the options related to structural relocation and home elevation as it relates to flood hazard mitigation or historic preservation purposes. So that's a little bit about our association. So when you're looking and talking about flood mitigation options, of course, there are many. There is the buyout option where you're demolishing and creating permanent green space. Building cannot be rebuilt on that property. There's the tear down rebuild option that happens in many areas across our country, at least. The relocation of buildings outside of the SFHA or the elevation of buildings are also options. And of course, those are really the options that I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of my presentation. So I tried to put in a lot of different pictures that showed elevation projects. This particular home was lifted in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. You can see how close it is to that shoreline. It did flood during Sandy, and this home has been elevated now. And in the future, those flood waters are going to go through that bottom level where there will no longer be living space. I have a short video. I hope this comes up for you all to see. This is about a elevation project by one of our member companies, S.J. Howe, who's based out of New Jersey.
Home elevation is the most viable option for residents. Stairs are built to ensure our clients can return home after the event and access their house at a further time.
Oops, let me see and get back in here. Hopefully we're back to the back to my presentation here. So that was an example of a typical home elevation job. I think that is a good example because it's a typical single family home, something that would commonly be lifted. So just some things about home elevation in general. Home elevation, of course, is the act of elevating someone's home above that base flood elevation. You're trying to get that home to a safer height. Basically rose to popularity following major hurricanes in the country, including Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. There are many reasons people choose to lift their houses, but some of them are possibly their house was flooded and now it's required because it was substantially damaged, or their flood insurance rates are becoming too high. Maybe they're looking to add a garage or storage underneath their property. We see in many areas where the population is really dense that this is one way that people actually add on to their homes. It might not be for flood hazard mitigation purposes. The house is below the base flood elevation and is requiring substantial improvement and just getting out of harm's way. You know, some families, they are choosing to elevate their home even without any type of federal or state funding to help them because they just want to be free of future flooding. Why would you elevate? Well, most people in this session know that flooding is the most expensive disaster type in the United States. Most people in our field know that the NFIP is over $20 billion in debt to the US Treasury and has often been in debt. It's been very hard to manage the National Flood Insurance Program because of the risky properties it's insuring. Another reason to elevate is subsidized insurance rates are starting to readjust to actuarial rates through risk rating 2.0, and we are starting to see where people's insurance rates are becoming difficult for them to afford. And if they don't do any type of mitigation, many people will just be forced out of their properties because they will not be able to afford flood insurance. Flood mitigation projects reduce the risk of flooding and keep flood insurance rates affordable overall. And then every dollar spent on mitigation projects saves between $8 and $11 in disaster recovery costs. This is a good reason here when you talk about the rising flood insurance rates. So one way to combat the rising flood insurance costs is to elevate your home. And this graphic shows 3 different scenarios. In the first scenario, you're looking at the premium of a home that is 4 feet below the BFE, and their premium is looking to be $9,500 per year, which obviously is quite high. The next picture shows a premium at base flood elevation, and that premium is $1,400 approximately a year. Now, the third premium is a home that is 3 feet above the base flood elevation, so they are considered completely mitigated. You can see they have flood vents in their property, and their premium is $427 a year approximately. Now, we know our different flood proofing companies can give these estimates to homeowners, and these are stark numbers. So these pre-flood map buildings, their policy rates are drastically increasing. They are going to keep increasing. And this just shows a homeowner, like if you want to elevate your home and you think elevation might be expensive, if you actually take a look at what your insurance premium is going to be without elevating your home, you can see where the elevation is going to save you some money actually in the long run. So types of homes that can be lifted, really anything can be lifted. I have a variety of homes in this picture. They may not look that different, but they are all a little bit different. Over on the bottom here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is a full masonry home. That's a very heavy building that was safely lifted and set back down on a new foundation. The home up here has a chimney. That's very common for buildings to be lifted with a chimney, and that chimney remains intact and remains working into the future. I have a home here that's really in a dense population. You can see the house next to it clearly had been lifted. House on this side probably should be lifted. But anyhow, these are very tight spaces. But these contractors are skilled in getting their equipment in underneath this building, getting it lifted, getting the new foundation, whatever it may be underneath there, and then putting the whole house back together. And it looks like it fits right into the neighborhood. So sometimes people think if the houses are too tight that you can't get in there to lift them. And usually These contractors are skilled and they are able to do that. So this is just a little bit further on what types of structures can be lifted. Basically anything, homes with crawl spaces, slab on grade homes can be lifted. That's very common in the South. Split level buildings or buildings with attached garage can be lifted. And masonry homes, as I mentioned, can definitely be lifted safely. Just one little comment on safety and equipment as far as home elevation goes. Most companies now would be using a unified hydraulic jacking machine. And this system makes it possible for that building to be lifted up in a unified way where it's all going up at the same time, as opposed to different sides of the houses going up a little bit here, a little bit there. That unified system controls the lift. And with that, that makes these lifts very safe, and that makes the structures, that's what allows the structures to stay intact during that lift and during the whole project. So the equipment now that structural movers, structural lifters have, it is so specialized that it really preserves the integrity of the buildings that are being lifted or relocated. So what's the process of construction as you start a home elevation project? You saw a little bit of that in our video, but this is kind of the things that a homeowner would go through if they were doing a home elevation project. First thing is the disconnects of utilities. There probably will be a little bit of pre-lift demolition as they're clearing out impediments on the property, including maybe the old foundation. Then you'll work on the actual home elevation or the lift. After the lift, there might be a little bit of post-lift demolition. Then in pilings, footings, or foundation, sill plates and the like would be installed. Then the house will be set back down. Then the access to the home, the type of work that goes on outside with decks and stairs and the like would happen. After that, you do the rough-ins of all the utilities. Then any exterior or interior improvements that need to be done. And one of the things that I liked about the home in our video that we showed, you could see from the video that there was very little to be done as far as exterior improvements after that lift. And that building in particular too, there's really not much to be done in the interior. Some folks move in without doing any type of interior improvement at all post home elevation. Then you'd have your final inspections and then work on getting your certificate of occupancy. There's a lot of financing options available for people with home elevation projects. We do see people that are just spending their own money. They're spending their own cash on a home elevation project. They just do not want to go through a flood event again, and they're choosing to use their own money. Equity financing is always a possibility if people have equity in their home. We've seen local grant funding, state grant funding, and matching grant funds available in many areas. ICC dollars, or the increased cost of compliance dollars. If a building is insured through the NFIP and became over 50% damaged, they would be eligible for $30,000 through their NFIP policy to use for home elevation. There's the 203K loan mortgage tool, different types of disaster recovery money, post-disaster mitigation programs, pre-disaster mitigation programs and funding. And in the Storm Act that recently passed Congress, they created a revolving loan fund, which I think it is slated to be available in 2 years, which will again offer funding to homeowners for home elevation or other mitigation techniques. So how does elevation help homeowners? Well, their home becomes resilient. They get a new foundation, they're higher, they're up to code, their home is mitigated from future flood damage, their home is now at the correct BFE. They hopefully will not experience any more economic or emotional costs that are associated with the terrible event disasters such as flooding. The flood insurance rates for that home decrease to their lowest level if their home is elevated and they install the proper flood vents with their new on their new foundation. How does elevation help communities? Well, number one, it preserves the tax base. Property taxes are very important to communities. If people leave communities on a broad scale, that community and those folks left behind are forced to figure out a way to pay for their community services with what is left of their property tax base. That's an important reason why some communities choose elevation. In many states, school aid is tied to a student. So if several students move out of community, because maybe their house is demolished, and what goes with them is their school aid. And so when we have communities where they lose a lot of students, like in my state, I'm in Wisconsin, if we have a small community that loses several homes that have children in them, they are really pulling away that school aid. And eventually these small communities are really going to struggle to fund their schools. Home elevation keeps communities intact by keeping those houses and neighborhoods together. You won't experience checkerboard neighborhoods that we see sometimes when there are buyout programs, and some people want the buyout, other people don't. So you have a house that's vacant, and then you have a house there, and then a vacant lot next to it, and maybe another vacant lot, and then a house elevated here, or a house over here. It's just a kind of a checkerboard effect. And what that leads to, those vacant lots often lead to very costly maintenance for little towns or cities. And they also can become dangerous areas where people either congregate or sometimes use them as kind of junk areas. So those are never really the ideal thing for a community. Elevation stabilizes the real estate market and property values, and importantly retains our housing. We are obviously we are in the midst of a massive nationwide housing shortage, and keeping housing in areas, especially affordable housing, low to moderate income housing, homes that people sometimes don't think we should elevate, but if we keep those homes, we retain the home ownership, we retain the housing for people who might otherwise not be able to be homeowners anymore. Home elevation engages multiple local tradespeople and contractors in every project that they do. The lifter may not be from that town because there are only so many structural movers and structural lifters across the country, but every other person on that project is going to be local. You're going to have a local electrician, a local carpenter, a local landscaper. So these are very, very localized job building opportunities. Any home elevation project would be. Home elevation is environmentally responsible. We are choosing to not just tear something down and throw it in the landfill. People sometimes think, one and done, you throw it in a landfill and you don't have to think about it again. There is a perpetual cost to landfills. There's an environmental cost, and that has to do with the toxicity of what happens in a landfill. And there's a financial cost for communities to maintain those landfills. That cost goes on and on. Sometimes we're preserving historic buildings through elevation, and we are saving natural resources. It's estimated that every 1,000 square feet of a wood frame building uses approximately 250 trees to build that. How does elevation help the US taxpayers? Well, it ends the flood rebuild cycle, which we know costs us a lot of money. It ends subsidizing risky insurance policies in flood prone areas, which we know cost us a lot of money as US taxpayers. Makes communities overall more resilient. With resilient communities that are strong and healthy are good for all of us. And it really begins the turnaround of the badly in debt NFIP program. So some of the numbers as far as how successful elevation has been in different areas of the country. Post-Katrina, there have been 35,000 homes approximately elevated in Louisiana. Like I mentioned, some areas are 70% plus elevated. Post Sandy in New Jersey and New York, it's estimated that over 10,000 buildings have been elevated, and those families now are living in their homes, and those homes are not going to flood and to the point where they're going to not be able to stay in their home. Just some pictures of different elevation projects. This is a very large scale project, but it's kind of interesting seeing how the work was done. This is a picture of a lower elevation with an open foundation on the bottom. I always think this particular house, it looks like it's been there forever. I wouldn't have guessed that it had been elevated. This home is actually in Mandeville, Louisiana, and you can see the high elevation with the open foundation. Just an absolutely beautiful building that is now mitigated from future flood damage and is going to be a beautiful home for a family for many, many years to come. In this town of Mandeville, I think that the estimate is like 76% of the town has been elevated now. So all of those families are going to be safe from the floods that have happened and likely will happen in the future. Here's a few other pictures where buildings were elevated with some type of enclosure. These buildings have that open bottom that you can see, and just a wide variety of how things look after they've been elevated. A lot of this depends on where in the country it's happening. This is a beautiful historic building that was elevated. You can see the before picture, and then the during, the lift picture, and then the finished picture. And I do think that the finished picture does this property justice, and it looks beautiful in its elevated state. So we always use a little tagline, elevate before it's too late. In certain areas, we know for sure it's going to flood again. And this is one way to mitigate properties from future damage. I've talked about just all the different reasons for elevating, you know, preserving the tax base, we think is one of the strongest ones. We do believe that homes can safely remain in their flood prone areas, depending on where they are and the velocity of those flood waters. So many areas, this is a viable option. Keeps communities together, preserves the tax base, helps us deal with our housing shortage that we have. Other things that we think about are, is it right for the individual and is it right for the community? And many communities suffer when homes are torn down in their areas. If they can't ever build on that property again and they have to maintain it forever and they have a housing shortage problem, communities can end up in trouble after they have too many buyouts in their areas. And then is it right for the country? You know, there's so many things we have to think about when we're talking about mitigation of properties. Right now, I have just recently read that the average single family home, the cost of building that home has went up like $35,000 in the last year because of the increase in the actual absolute explosion of cost for building materials. So when you talk about what type of country do we want, home ownership is one of the staples really of the United States, and elevating homes allows many families to be able to continue to be homeowners. So that's my presentation. I am going to sign off here and sign back in and answer any questions that anybody might have. But again, I'm with the International Association of Structural Movers. My contact information is listed there. I'll be happy to answer any follow-up questions after the session. And thank you so much for joining.
Okay, great presentation, Tammie. We have a lot of questions, so we're just going to jump into it. The first one, approximately how much does a typical single family home cost to elevate?
So that's a great question, and I would hesitate to give an actual cost for a home because the price varies so widely across the country. I mentioned the ICC money, which if you have an NFIP policy and you can access that little benefit in your policy right now, that's $30,000. In some areas of the country, that $30,000 is stretched pretty far and can cover almost a complete elevation project. I'm hearing of projects in the Carolinas that are running in those you know, around that amount of money, and people are not having to put a ton of private money into their projects. Really depends on the labor market in the area, depends on if you have to use union workers. In some states, they will only allow you to do that. So it really varies across the country. But when you look at the different comparisons, the cost benefit analysis, what's happening right now with lumber prices across the country, you can see where the investment in an elevation project would really hold a lot of weight.
Okay, that's great. This kind of tails off of that question. What about moving a home to a new location?
So, and I just want to mention too, before I answer that question, that my contact information was given. If anybody has specific questions about certain areas of the country, please feel free to contact me after this presentation, and I will definitely follow up with concrete numbers for that state or area. So as far as moving a home to a different location, we are huge fans of doing that. Current FEMA regulations don't really allow us, if the property is in a buyout situation, that property goes with that buyout. So they don't allow us at that point to relocate. But choosing relocation as an option is a great option for certain areas. I myself live in Wisconsin, and some of our small towns that have flooding problems have several vacant lots in those little towns. And to be able to keep that housing stock in those areas is a superb option. Relocation is not an excessively expensive process. And again, like right now, I'm talking a lot about lumber prices. And even if all you ended up was a shell of a house, which normally you aren't, normally these houses are very structurally sound and nice buildings to move. The cost of being able to do that as opposed to building new is just a really interesting stark thing to look at right now.
Great. What is the threshold between elevating a home and tearing it down?
I am not sure that I understand that question. I don't
Just
know if that
based on
person could put a
the amount of damage, what's the threshold between lifting it up or just tearing it down, buying it out and getting the money?
I mean, a person has regardless of how much damage is in that property, the homeowner has the decision-making authority on what they decide to do. If your home is 51% damaged, which we have seen across the country, many building inspectors never ever declare any properties in their cities, towns, or municipalities 51% damage, so they don't reach that threshold. But if your property reaches that, you are going to have to do some mitigation. And you have the opportunity to do mitigation, or maybe you would try to get into a buyout program at that time.
Okay, great. Have any homeowner associations in the past impeded any of the elevating of homes based on their local subdivision regulations?
I have heard of different parts of the country where maybe there are very strict guidelines with historic properties.
Okay.
And strict guidelines with the height of buildings. Like for instance, Key West, they have regulations on how tall a building can be. So they have pushed back a little bit on elevation in some of those areas. But again, if another area I'm thinking about is some historic areas like Charleston. The problem is what's happening in those communities, they're doing nothing at this point to mitigate. So they're pushing back on elevation, but they're doing nothing to solve the problems that we can see from the outside looking in.
Okay. This question comes in. Are you familiar with any examples of a row home being separated along the party wall and elevated while neighboring homes remain at the original elevation?
So if I understand the question correctly, a row house would be where these houses are all connected to each other. And I can't think of a specific example about that. So I cannot think of that at this point.
Okay. Here comes one. In our jurisdiction, we have quite a few single family story homes that gut the interior and utilize the walls to support a new second floor that is special flood hazard area compliant. Is that something you see often?
So Shelby, can you read that one back to me?
Yes, ma'am, not a problem. This just comes in our jurisdiction, we have quite a few single story family homes that gut the interior and utilize the walls to support a new second floor. Do you see that often?
Definitely a frequent thing with a home elevation project. We do see that often. I have seen buildings that add on 2 stories when they lift. I mean, I have seen just about everything.
Okay.
So that would be a very common practice, and it would be something that a home elevation contractor would be very familiar with working with.
Okay. And then next we have, is it typical for an elevation to be at the BFE, or is there usually a freeboard added to lower flood insurance costs when doing a buyout through a FEMA program?
Absolutely typical to have a freeboard addition on that project. You're recommending a couple feet at least. So, and that's just pretty much standard across what we would recommend it from our industry. And all of our contractors do work very, very closely with the homeowner and with the building officials in every local area that they're working across in the country.
That's great. Well, that looks like it wraps up our Q&A session. I appreciate it greatly. And I know everybody else that asked the questions did.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Shelby. And thank you everybody for coming to the session on home elevation. Again, my contact information is out there. If you have any other specific questions, please contact me at your leisure.
That's great. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to Michael MacGowan. He is a design engineer with infrastructure protection and flood mitigation business at ILC Dover. And today he's going to be talking about flood protection measures, when, where, and how.
Hi, my name is Michael MacGowan. I'm a senior engineer and certified floodplain manager at ILC Dover. Today, we're going to discuss floodproofing measures, specifically dry floodproofing. Today I'm going to take you through what to consider when specifying dry flood proofing. To start this conversation, I'd like to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of what dry flood proofing is and what situations it's best suited for. So what is dry flood proofing? Dry flood proofing is a structure or device that prevents water or debris from entering a designated area. Wet flood proofing allows water pressure to equalize on both sides of a structure to prevent structural failures. Dry flood proofing, on the other hand, keeps the water on one side of the structure, which requires either the building or dry flood proofing device to react to hydrostatic loading. To your right, you can see various examples of dry flood proofing solutions. There are standard offerings such as flood doors, bolt-on panels, sliding doors, and stop log systems. Passive systems, which deploy automatically as the floodwaters rise, are also available. These solutions are very attractive from a functionality standpoint as they require no human intervention. However, you must remember to look at the entire picture when specifying a system. Since some passive systems lay horizontally on the ground, they may require significant ground space depending on the design flood elevation and may create a trip hazard during low-level flooding. The International Building Code points to ASCE 24 for guidance on dry flood proofing. When should dry flood proofing be used? When all other means of protection have been exhausted. First, I'd like to introduce ILC Dover, the neatest company you've never heard of. At ILC Dover, we have made it our mission to provide reliable products for life-critical applications. We have made every spacesuit since the Apollo mission and continue to work with NASA to produce the next generation of suit technologies. Pictured here is the radome, which is an inflatable structure 110 feet tall and 120 feet in diameter that houses a radar system. This radome was designed to withstand Category 4 hurricanes and has been operational on a repurposed oil rig in the Pacific for over 12 years without any issue. Notably, the inflatable dome interfaces to the oil rig via a clamp that captures an encapsulated rope, which we refer to as a deadman. The deadman concept can be found throughout various ILC products as a way to terminate and seal between soft goods and hardware. We'll touch more on this later. Some of you may remember the Mars Pathfinder surrounded by airbags bouncing around upon landing on Mars. Those airbags were made by ILC Dover. The robust, abrasion-resistant base material was Vectran, which is the same material used on our tunnel plug system designed for the Department of Homeland Security to hold back 30 feet of water pressure for anti-terror purposes. We also produce many of the blimps that are flying around your favorite sporting events. ILC Dover was initially asked to provide a custom point-of-view system after the flooding events of Hurricane Sandy. We have taken the lessons learned through our thousands of hours of research and development, value of point-of-view storage, ease of deployment, and acquisition cost, and these have led to our current generation of dry flood-proofing products. Post-Hurricane Sandy, we were engaged by the New York City Transit to discuss flood-proofing solutions. We discussed current and future state needs with the New York City Transit. Their existing solutions took 4 people, 6 hours per stairwell, and there are hundreds of stairwells throughout the city. With New York City Transit, we developed our stairwell FlexGate technology that's being used at over 70 sites throughout New York City. The Mitigation Assessment Team report was done by a team of well-respected floodplain engineers after Sandy discovered that flood shields that were on site in many cases were never deployed. Based on their findings, this was due to a lack of training, but also a lack of understanding of how the systems worked. Manpower was also an issue, as many of their systems required teams of people to deploy, and those resources were unavailable. Using the findings of the Mitigation Assessment Team report, we can define the key requirements for an effective floodproofing system: reliable, easy to use, reusable, stored at the point of use. This is a go, no go chart that we use for dry floodproofing projects. This is a typical project outline that we use for dry floodproofing projects. As with any project, accurately defining the requirements keeps the design process smooth. Key requirements for a dry floodproofing project are base flood elevation, design flood elevation, impact requirements, leakage requirements, quantity of deployment personnel, and temperature range of operation. Base flood elevation, or BFE, is the elevation of flooding, including wave height, having a 1% chance of being equal or exceeded in any given year. This is typically derived from flood modeling, FEMA, or other flood models, and it's normally in a local or national datum, such as NAVD 88. Design flood elevation, or DFE, is the elevation of the design flood, including wave height, relative to the datum specified on the community's flood hazard map. The minimum is set by the NFIP at either 1 or 2 feet above the base flood elevation on the building class. Communities may choose to add additional height, known as freeboard, to the design flood elevation. Allowable leakage is based on the amount of leakage the overall system protecting the building may allow and remain substantially impermeable. Per ASCE 24, to remain substantially impermeable, the building or space must have a maximum of accumulated water of 4 inches of depth in the given space during a 24-hour period. The square footage of the building affects this calculation, and every potential leak point in the system, such as a pipe pass-through or crack in the foundation, may affect the entire building. Impact loading is the loads on a structure caused by flood-borne debris striking the structure. This requirement is often overlooked until late in the design cycle, and debris impact may ultimately be the requirement that determines if the dry floodproofing system works in the real world or not. Quantity of personnel. Enough personnel must be available to deploy all flood mitigation systems for a property within 12 hours. Another requirement to consider is temperature range for operation, as this may affect some of the design drivers. Once the previously mentioned requirements are defined, product selection can begin. Product selection should be based upon system-level attributes. These attributes must be traded against your day-to-day operations, as each site and customer is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for flood protection. The system-level attributes, which we will discuss, are broken down into 5 main categories. Deployment time is critical when selecting a dry floodproofing system. Codes require the time to deploy a floodproofing system around a designated dry space to be no more than 12 hours from notification. System storage location and transit time play a large role in the overall deployment time of a system. Systems not stored at the point of use must consider transit and pickup time when determining total deployment time from notification. While on-site storage may require the use of a forklift or other motorized vehicles, off-site storage is further complicated by the fact that the parts will need to be transported through the sea of people all combating traffic in an attempt to evacuate. In addition to transit time, overall deployment time is heavily determined by ease of deployment. Ease of deployment is primarily impacted by the type of the system, quantity and type of components, as well as the weight of the components. There are 2 distinct types of systems, with a third which represents a middle ground: passive systems, and manual systems with a mechanical advantage. The reliability of a system is highly dependent on the materials selected to construct the system. Since most people have a general knowledge of corrosion experienced by plain carbon steel and know the benefits of utilizing stainless steel, we will focus on the material selection and utilization for sealing interfaces. Neoprene, EPDM, and silicone are all common materials used in dry floodproofing systems. Each system has its pros and cons, as shown here in an excerpt from Rogers' Technical Sealing Guide. C-set, also known as compression set, is an often overlooked factor. If a sealing material has a high compression set value, it will not readily rebound and will be less reliable when compressed time after time. Shown here is a swing gate, which includes a permanently mounted seal that is not protected from environmental or tampering hazards. Environmental factors such as UV, temperature cycling, and chemical runoff may damage seals if not properly protected or sealed. These environmental factors can cause seals to become brittle and to debond if adhesively connected, or to simply degrade over time. All of these result in a less effective sealing surface. The gaskets shown here are no longer connected to their systems. This may have occurred from unintentional or intentional human interference or environmental factors. Imagine being on an industrial site with a pallet jack or cart. As you maneuver it around, objects are occasionally bumped. If one of these objects happened to be a seal for a floodproofing system, it may be damaged and not repaired until a maintenance cycle occurred, thus rendering the system less watertight than required. Acquisition cost is often the most focused on aspect related to the cost when selecting a dry floodproofing system. However, the life cycle cost, which is the sum of all recurring and one-time costs over the full lifespan of a system, can have a larger impact on the total cost of ownership than one may think. Many of these items have already been discussed relative to system operation and functionality, such as storage, maintenance, and inspection. But it must be remembered that they all also impact the overall life cycle cost. One item that we have not heavily touched on is closure time. Closure time can be relative to the time required to deploy before an event, to retract after an event, and the time closed for training and annual deployments. The closure time can be linked to cost, as goods and services will be unavailable during a shutdown and personnel will be reprioritized. Some dry flood proofing systems have been designed with closure time in mind to reduce site downtime at all stages. As previously mentioned, building codes recommend periodic deployment of dry flood proofing systems, and locations such as New York City are now enforcing annual deployments of dry flood proofing systems. These periodic deployments are critical to ensuring your site will be prepared to deploy your system in case of an emergency. Without periodic deployments, there is no assurance that the parts will be where they are needed. We've heard of people unknowingly using the plates for dry flood proofing as ramps, and others have simply lost their parts over time. Additionally, periodic deployments keep current employees trained so they'll be ready for a storm. When beginning to plan your dry flood proofing system, it's important to consider that these practice deployments can have a substantial financial burden on system owners if systems are stored off-site or require significant manpower to deploy. For example, the Whitney Museum in New York City currently spends $50,000 a year for their annual deployment due to the location of their dry flood proofing parts and the manpower required to assemble. Systems that can be deployed in stages provide the flexibility to keep the property open until the last possible moment before an event occurs, and provides the fastest recovery time. If the floodproofing system does not require heavy machinery to travel through a disaster zone to retract the system, then the user can reopen as soon as the threat of storm has passed and any collected water has been drained. In order to properly protect structures from flood damage, the entire load case must be taken into account. When protecting a vertical structure, the loads are imparted as depicted here. You must consider the combined load case of hydrostatic, hydrodynamic, impact, and wind loads, as these loads will be simultaneously applied to the system. ILC Dover takes all of these loads into account during our design process. While the International Building Code points to ASCE 24 for floodproofing guidance relative to materials, leakage rate, and standard practices, ASCE 24 points to ASCE 7 for guidance on properly applying the load requirements we discussed earlier. Each site and customer is unique. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for flood protection. During the initial stages of specifying a dry floodproofing system, all elements must be considered, not just acquisition cost. Soft goods technology offers many benefits that allow ILC to respond to customer needs. Low stowed volumes, easy to deploy, point-of-use storage options, low maintenance, and high reliability are just some of the system attributes that ILC Dover Flex Wall and Flex Gate systems have. Thank you for your time today.
That was a great presentation, Michael. It's always nice to hear about some dry flood proofing options. So with that said, we have a couple questions that have come in. Do you have to complete a dry flood proofing certificate after a project is completed?
So there is not a dry floodproofing certificate that you have to complete after the project is completed. Typically what we do once an installation is complete is we do kind of a certification and acceptance checklist. And that's kind of an internal document that we generate to make sure that the product was installed correctly. And then typically there's an accompanying on-site water test.
Okay.
Just to verify and validate the design. Okay,
that's great. Next, is it common to have flood proofing projects funded via federal grants, or do the property owners usually absorb the cost by themselves?
Both. So, you know, so sometimes the smaller projects, for instance, like a shop owner who has one doorway opening that he's trying to protect, the price on that, it might be such that he can fund that himself. Whereas some of the larger municipal projects that we work on, like hospitals, for instance, like protecting the entire perimeters of hospitals, most of the time, those are FEMA funded grants. And so after Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of federal and FEMA money that was flowing for the flood protection, especially in that New York City, New Jersey area. We're hopeful that with the upcoming infrastructure bill that's being passed, there's going to be some more money flowing to all mitigation techniques and some of that in particular dry flood proofing.
Okay, that sounds great. Let's see, that kind of wraps up any of our questions, but would you like to explain or go into detail about any small or large scale projects that you've installed in the past?
Yeah, so we have a variety of products, and I'll talk to kind of our standard products first. We have a product called our Flex Cover Door. That's really it's an FM certified product. So FM Global, huge insurance provider, has certified this as a flood protection product that they recommend to people to some of their protected properties. And so these range in the height of flood protection from 2 feet to 4 feet, and then stackable for a 6-foot solution. And it's made for single doors and double doors. And in addition, we have the ability to kind of daisy chain that configuration to make more of a perimeter or a larger solution using an integral post. And that's our standard product. We keep those in stock in our warehouse. We're based out of Delaware, so those are in stock in our warehouse in Delaware. And then we have a lot of other projects that we're working on, custom solutions. You know, the customers will come to us. A lot of times, architects and engineers will approach us and say, "Hey, we have a product. We have a project that's in a specific floodplain. You know, this is a high design flood elevation, or it's a low one. It has impact. You know, these impact requirements, and then we'll custom design a solution for that particular hospital." So, I mean, one hospital it comes to mind. I'm thinking of a couple of projects that we're working on in the New York, New Jersey area right now. The first one is the Jersey City Medical Center, where we're going to be providing some flood protection barriers for the exterior of that building. And these are actually going to be stored on site in a below grade trench. So that trench has been created to store our flexible fabric, and then it's going to be lifted into place at a series of permanent posts with a mechanical winch. So that winch is actually going to pull the fabric barrier up into place, and we're protecting design flood elevations up to 12 feet high. And spans up to 150 to 200 feet continuous.
Oh, wow.
So our capabilities with tension fabric are pretty broad. I mean, we do very small openings, very low design flood elevations, 2 feet, 2 feet high, several feet in opening, to many feet high, with very large impact requirements. You know, considering the floating debris coming off the Hudson River for some of these projects. So that's kind of a broad overview of just some of the different projects that we've worked on in that infrastructure protection space.
Well, that's great. All right. Well, that concludes our session D2 today. I want to thank all of our wonderful presenters and have a great rest of the day.